Does Duke Kwon and Gregory Thompson's new book add anything new to the conversation about reparations? Well, let's take a look. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. All right, so I have here the new book, Reparations, which has caused, at least in conservative Christian evangelical circles, has caused a little bit of a stir, you could say, with some back and forth discussion around it. And so I wanted to give some thoughts on it. Let's dive into my normal format here, with the main idea, the research, the readability, and then the reasonableness. So the main idea here is essentially this book is it's a call towards the predominantly white evangelical church in America. It's a call and a summons to have a more reparative attitude or posture towards their black brothers and sisters in the country. So there's a couple things, though, in my mind, that distinguish this book from other conversations and discussions around the topic of reparations, which of course is controversial and very charged. But there's a few things that specifically set this book apart that I want to say right here at the outset before I dive in further. Two things. One is it's really a call to the church. So the term reparations immediately conjures up topics about like economic policy and particularly the role of the government. This is not so much a book about that. They acknowledge that the government probably will have to play an important role in some sort of reparations conversation, but this really is a book towards the church, explicitly towards the church to take reparative reparations actions. So it's to the church, not to the government, not even really about government policy. It's about church actions. And secondly, as they deal with the topic of white supremacy, which takes up a good portion of the book, they try to carefully define that and unpack that. They talk about white supremacy through the lens of theft, which I thought was really interesting. It's an interesting nuance. But the idea of that, the idea that they put forward, that they try to wrestle with, is that white supremacy is primarily kind of a thieving ideology. So white supremacy steals not only wealth, but it steals cultural power. It steals truth. So I found the idea of thinking of white supremacy as kind of a cultural theft was really fascinating. And so that's an important thing that I think sets this book apart. So it's to the church, and the ways they deal with white supremacy are a little different than what I've read in other accounts. So right away, you might have a sense of whether or not this is something that resonates with you or something that's challenging to you, but know that going into it, it does bring something, I think, specific. So let's go through the rest of the topics here. The research behind the book, it's pretty wide-ranging, which is impressive given its relatively short length, which I'll talk more a bit about in a minute, but it does touch on, there's sociological research behind it and historical research, and then also theological and ethical kind of research behind it. It really moves through all those topics. On the more sociological, historical side, they pull a lot on people, for example, like David Bryan Davis and Orlando Patterson, who are well-known writers, among others too. Those are just two examples. They, in the first section of the book especially, they deal with kind of the history of race and justice and white supremacy in America and American culture. That's where they lean into the sociological kind of aspects. But it's really well footnoted, and because of the length of the book, they are more interested in summarizing and pointing to, rather than giving like full-throated engagement with, if that makes sense, with some of these historical accounts. But they're well cited, well footnoted. You can chase it down in the there's a footnote section and all that that you can find out more, which I thought was helpful. But then also when they move more into the theological, ethical discussion at the end. When they call the church to kind of own this ethic, there actually is a really more in-depth engagement with Aquinas than I was expecting. I was pleasantly surprised by that. They really deal with some of Aquinas' ethical, theological thought when it comes to reparation and restitution, which strengthened that section of the book, I thought. And they also deal quite a bit with some Old Testament law and ethics as it relates to restitution and repair on the ethical side of things. And they lean on people, especially like Brueggemann, Walter Brueggemann, well-known Old Testament scholar, shows up quite a bit. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the research behind the argument. It's pretty wide-ranging, but it's also more summary in nature, if that makes sense. The readability, I mentioned this a few times, but the book is really short. It's not, I'll hold it up here, it's really not very long, and the chapters are short. So in that sense, it's highly readable. The style is very, very approachable. But it's challenging, particularly if you're a white evangelical, come from that background, as I do. It's challenging and confrontational, so it's harder to read from that angle, but it's not hard to read in terms of its style and its approachability. It's also very clearly written, as they're pulling on a lot of deep research, so I was grateful for that. And then also which this will lead into my final point here, but I found it pretty nuanced, actually. Nuanced, but not equivocating, if that makes sense. So I'll unpack that here in a minute as I move into the reasonableness of it. So what's the reasonableness of this book? That's what always people want to know when they jump into a book on a charged, difficult topic like reparations. There's two things in particular I want to note that I appreciated about this book. And I'll say at the outset, even, just bumped the camera. I'll say here, I'm not sure where I'm at personally on the grander topic of reparations, especially as it relates to government actions. So I'll just say that I'm a bit of a work in process on that. I understand the kind of arguments for and arguments against from the government action perspective. So just know that that's where I'm at going into this. There are a couple things I really appreciated about this book, though, and I'll unpack them now. Two things in particular. One is the piece of nuance. I found they really struck a good balance of being confrontational and bold in their call. I mean, they're calling the church to take a reparative posture. There's just make no bones about that. However, they're nuanced and balanced in their ways stepping towards that. For example, there's a section on where they recount the American church's faithfulness in terms of justice and race through history, and also the church's faithlessness. So both ways in which the church has operated faithfully towards the call to justice, but also the ways that the church has abandoned that. So the inclusion of both those narratives is an example of how I think they're striving to not fall into the common ditches on either side of this argument that are so prevalent in our politics right now. And multiple times they say, even as it regards white supremacy and the history of America as its entanglement with white supremacy, they explicitly say we're trying to avoid the common errors of either just calling America this like horrible top to bottom evil, nation, which is prevalent in some maybe more progressive sides of the conversation, but we're also trying to avoid the simplistic, patriotic, American can do no wrong, American exceptionalist narrative. And they really explicitly try to say we're trying to avoid those errors, and we're trying to just look at what is true about our history. And so I really appreciated that attempt towards nuance and balance. Another pro is what I already mentioned, is that I really like that this is geared just towards the church. The title maybe trips some people up on that because it immediately makes you think of the government and economic policies specifically, but I really like that it's towards the church, and I really like that it's broader than economics. They talk about wealth, they talk about the ways in which wealth has been extracted from and kept from particularly Black Americans through history, but they also talk about truth, history narratives, and they talk about power, which is that's a sticky subject with a lot of stuff swirling around philosophically right now. But I really like that they included it, and it gave I think the book a more kind of fully orbed view of what effect racial doctrines can have historically as they affect people groups. It's more than just economics. There's a lot more going on, and that I think really buttresses the argument of the book. So I don't think this is a perfect book. I think it's not possible, but I think it's really good. I think it's very good. It's very well researched, very clearly written, and I think it's a welcome call to the white church particularly. It's at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is they're trying to call the church, make an argument that the white church has been embedded in a culture of complicity and comfort that is very negatively impacted by racial ideas and racial hierarchical doctrines, and this is a call for the church to see that complicity historically and to come out of it, to kind of see it and remove itself from it and push against it and adopt a posture of wanting to see repair happen, wanting to see restitution happen. And I think to that end, it's a really welcome voice. Different people are going to have different reactions to it and whether or not your traction is ultimately going to go where they want you to go with it. But I think it's a very, very clarion call and a welcome voice into this difficult conversation. And the final chapter does give some really, I thought, compelling ideas for practical things the church can do in their local neighborhoods to have a reparative posture towards their Black brothers and sisters that may be around them in their cities. So I hope this gives you a sense of whether or not this book is for you, I would argue that I think people should just read it, regardless of whether or not where you land on the grander topic of reparations. I think it's really an important book to read, an important book to wrestle with. It is going to provoke you. It's probably going to challenge you. But man, it's worth reading, and I'm really, really grateful that Kwon and Thompson have put this out into the world. I think they did a lot of work. They did took a lot of care, and yeah, and it's a good argument. It's an unsettling one, and you can even tell on the ways I'm speaking with it, I'm still working through some of what I think about it. But it's a worthy voice in the conversation. So I would definitely commend it as a resource and as something to be read. Hope you found this helpful. I would love to hear what you think of this book if you've read it, or if you pick it up and get a chance to read it. Let me know what you think. Post below, post questions, post thoughts as always, and thank you for watching.